The fluorescent lights in Building C at the Royal Small Arms Factory hummed with that specific frequency found only at 3 in the morning. Wilson stood at the drafting table, his Cambridge education and 15 years of professional background concentrated in the pencil lines tracing across blueprint paper. The L1A1 rifle, the reliable tool that had served Britain since the 1950s, was reaching the end of its era, and the world was moving forward. He had experienced this before. The EM2 in the 1950s, a bullpup design ahead of its time, was sidelined by the international push for the 7.62mm cartridge. Now, in 1977, with 5.56 becoming the new standard across Western forces, he had his second chance. The Americans used M16s. The Soviets had transitioned to the AK-74. France was perfecting the FAMAS. Austria had the Steyr AUG. Britain needed to modernize, and the responsibility fell to specialists like Wilson to make it a reality. The bullpup configuration was elegant in its logic. By placing the action and magazine behind the trigger, the overall size of the hardware was reduced without losing barrel length. A rifle could be as compact as a submachine gun, while keeping the accuracy and range of a full-length service arm. It seemed ideal for mechanized infantry operating from tight armored vehicles, ideal for urban settings, ideal on paper. Wilson's team at Enfield Lock was top tier. Artisans who could hand-fit components to incredibly tight tolerances. Specialists who understood materials like poets understood meter. Designers who could turn the abstract needs of modern engagement into working mechanical systems. They worked with deep pride, carrying the legacy of British history. Lee Enfield, Bren, Sterling, names that had seen personnel through major global conflicts. The project took shape gradually through the late 1970s and early 1980s. The SA80, officially known as the L85A1, would be compact at just 785mm long. It featured a SUSAT optical sight as standard, giving every individual an edge in accuracy that traditional sights couldn't provide. The bullpup layout was meant to resolve the classic conflict between size and handling. On the test range at Enfield, under managed conditions with pristine ammunition and technicians monitoring every detail with stopwatches, it performed well enough. The Ministry of Defense conducted trials in 1985. The SA80 was adopted to replace both the L1A1 and the Sterling. It was to be the nation's next-generation infantry system. Patterson recalled the official reveal. Fresh from university at 23, he was excited to work on something with real-world impact. He watched Wilson and the senior staff shake hands with officials. Celebratory toasts were made. Photos were taken. Everyone felt a sense of confidence and achievement. But equipment isn't truly tested on clean ranges with perfect supplies and observers standing by. It is tested where sand infiltrates everything, where rain turns to ice, and where mud is everywhere. It is tested by exhausted individuals who don't have time for complex maintenance in the heat of a crisis. It is tested when lives are on the line. The British forces entered the 1980s believing their equipment needs were met. The SA80 looked like the future. It seemed like the tool that would lead the infantry into the 21st century. What no one realized yet, what the team at Enfield couldn't see from their workshops, was that they had created one of the most controversial systems in modern history. The individuals who would discover this wouldn't be on a range in England, but in the harsh, wind-swept environments of the South Atlantic, and later in the intense heat of the Middle East. The gap between the drawing board and the field was about to be measured in ways that would leave a lasting impact on those involved. If accounts like this make you wonder how you'd react when everyone says you're right, but the reality is still hidden, share your thoughts in the comments and stay with us for the coming chapters. How do you trust your expertise when the ultimate test is still years away? The South Atlantic conflict arrived in April 1982, sudden and pressing. Forces occupied the islands, and Britain sent a naval task force 8,000 miles to respond. For the design team at Enfield, it was both a chance to see their work in action and a significant risk. A small number of early SA80s were issued to specific units for evaluation. Labeled as experimental and carried alongside the standard L1A1, they were put to the test in actual field conditions. Wilson supported the move. He believed the only way to truly know a system's worth was to put it in the hands of those in the field. The feedback that returned was deeply concerning. Patterson saw the reports filed under high-security classifications, magazines that wouldn't lock in properly under pressure. Something about the cold, the moisture, and the way the gear was handled with frozen hands. There were failures to cycle when the equipment got wet, and everything in that environment got wet. The charging handle was hard to use with gloves or numb fingers. These were noted as points for review, documented and cross-referenced. Yet, production didn't stop. The investment was too high. Too many livelihoods were tied to the factory staying active. Too much political reputation was at stake. The nation needed a new system, and the SA80 was it. The team believed the issues would be fixed in later batches. Engineering was a process of refinement. You couldn't expect a perfect result on the first try. Wilson told himself this during late nights, reviewing the reports from the South Atlantic. The core design was solid. The bullpup concept worked. Other nations were proving that. The issues were likely manufacturing details and assembly steps that could be tightened, not fundamental errors, not a reason to quit. Patterson, still young and convinced that every problem had a fix, shared that belief. He worked on updates for the magazine release and small changes to the internal mechanics. Technical issues met with technical answers. The system had to work. By the mid-1980s, the SA80 reached full production. Thousands were made at Enfield Lock and Nottingham. The familiar silhouette of the L1A1 began to fade from the inventory, replaced by the compact modern bullpup and its optical sight. Training units began receiving them. Personnel learned to operate, maintain, and carry them through drills in various climates. The reactions were mixed. Some liked the size and the optics. Others found the balance strange and the controls poorly placed for those used to traditional layouts. But the plan was set. The SA80 was the path forward. Everyone was told to adapt, learn, and trust it. In a quiet office in Nottingham, Wilson kept a private file of field reports. These weren't the polished summaries sent to the higher-ups, but raw accounts from those using the gear, cycle failures in cold weather, feeding issues during intense use, the awkward placement of the charging handle making it hard to clear a jam under stress. He convinced himself these were just the typical growing pains of any new system. Even the legendary M16 had faced severe criticism in past decades before it was refined. All equipment went through this. The SA80 would be fine. His wife once asked why he stayed so late, why his study light burned past midnight. He told her it was just the usual pressure. He didn't mention the growing fear he felt while reading those reports, that the elegant paper design might not survive the reality of the field. Patterson married in 1987. He felt a sense of importance and pride in his work, knowing he was equipping the next generation of service members. Neither Wilson nor Patterson knew that in 3 years, in the intense heat of the desert, the SA80 would face its ultimate trial. The results would change them both forever. For now, production continued. The crates were shipped, and the training went on. The modernization was in full swing. The designers felt they had fulfilled their mission. What they hadn't realized was the massive divide between a controlled environment and total chaos. Between theory and reality. Between gear that works when everything is fine and gear that must work when everything goes wrong. The lesson was coming. It would be defined by mechanical failures and the haunting question of a person who had been let down by their equipment. Did anyone who designed this ever have to rely on it when their life depended on it? When does certainty become a liability? The situation changed in August 1990. After the regional invasion, an international coalition formed. Britain prepared to send forces, and for the first time, the SA80 would be carried into a major desert conflict. Patterson was now 31, holding more responsibility. When a technical team was needed for the deployment, he was on the list. He told his family it would be simple evaluation work, far from any actual danger. Wilson, now in his late 50s, stayed in Nottingham. He handled the oversight, but he read every single update coming from the desert. The old doubts came back stronger than ever. The problems were no longer minor. They were total systemic failures caused by the desert environment. The system jammed constantly in the sand. This wasn't occasional, it was a persistent failure. The tight manufacturing tolerances that looked good on paper became a liability when dust entered the mechanism. Personnel found themselves in critical moments with equipment that wouldn't cycle or load. The plastic components began to fail under the intense sun. Materials tested in milder climates couldn't handle the extreme heat. The magazine release was easily triggered by accident. People found their magazines falling out at the worst possible times, while moving for cover or exiting vehicles. Worst of all, the design of the charging handle required the user to move out of their ready position to fix a jam. In a crisis, this meant losing focus on the threat and increasing personal risk. Patterson arrived in the region in January 1991. He expected to make small tweaks or show people how to clean their gear better. He still believed the issue was how the gear was being handled, not how it was built. That belief vanished within 3 days. In a maintenance tent, dozens of SA80s sat in pieces. Every single one had failed for a different reason. Broken internals, cracked casings, and mechanisms completely seized by sand. He heard stories of individuals having to use whatever else they could find, even abandoned local gear, because it was more reliable than what they had been issued. A veteran sergeant with decades of experience showed him the reality with quiet intensity. He tried to fire a single round, and the mechanism failed immediately. The handle wouldn't move properly. He had to force it, taking his focus entirely off any potential target. The sergeant looked at Patterson and said quietly, "You sent us here with gear that doesn't work. People were hurt because of this." Patterson wrote it down, his hands trembling. Back in Nottingham, Wilson read the reports in isolation. Each page was a list of failures, destroying every assumption he had held. The elegant bullpup design had become a nightmare in the field. The cost-saving manufacturing methods created flaws that only appeared under extreme use. The testing hadn't been nearly realistic enough. They had failed. It wasn't out of malice, but because they trusted their own expertise more than the reality of the battlefield. They designed for an ideal situation, not the messy reality of the world. Would you stand by your beliefs or accept the harsh truth of reality? Tell us in the comments which path you'd choose, and share this story with those who appreciate historical reality. What happens when your life's work puts others at risk? The Ministry of Defence was in a bind. Massive funds had been spent. Hundreds of thousands of units were in circulation. Admitting the entire system was fundamentally flawed was a political and financial nightmare, but they couldn't keep ignoring the failures in the field. The first move was typical: more cleaning kits and more training. They acted as if the problem was the personnel, not the gear. Thick manuals were issued on desert maintenance, but the failures didn't stop. Patterson returned home in March 1991. He was a different man, thinner, restless, unable to sleep. His family noticed the change, but didn't know the cause. He couldn't look at a technical drawing without seeing that sergeant's face or hearing those words. People were hurt because of this. He asked to work on a different project, but he was kept on the SA80 rectification effort. They refused to call it a failure. They called it rectification, as if a few small changes could fix a broken concept. Wilson and the team worked through 1991 and 1992. They tried new parts and small adjustments. They addressed the symptoms, but not the cause. The layout was still awkward. The tolerances were still too tight for sand. The materials were still vulnerable to heat. By 1993, even the bureaucrats had to admit the truth. The original designers couldn't fix the SA80. The problems were too deep. They needed help from the outside. It was a moment of deep humility. The decision to bring in Heckler & Koch, the German firm, felt like a national embarrassment to the team at Enfield. It took outside engineers to make the British system function. Patterson watched the new team arrive in 1995. They were professional and efficient. They didn't need to say anything about the past failures. The equipment spoke for itself. One of the engineers, a man named Schmidt, stopped by Patterson's desk one day. He looked at the old drawings on the wall and said, "A good design works when things are imperfect. A perfect design works when everything goes wrong." Patterson had no words. Wilson, nearing 60, started planning his exit. The project was now in the hands of the German firm. His job was simply to provide context and explain why certain compromises had been made in the past. It was humbling work. He watched younger people take apart his creation and find the flaws he had missed. He watched them succeed where he had not. He told his wife he was ready to retire, but they both knew he was carrying the weight of the project with him. You don't just walk away from that kind of outcome. Patterson left in 1994. He couldn't stay in that building anymore. "What will you do?" his wife asked. "I'm going to teach," he replied. "Someone needs to learn from what happened here. Can you find peace if you turn your failure into a lesson for others?" The L85A2 was launched in 2002 after years of intensive work by Heckler & Koch. Almost every major internal component was redesigned or improved. It was finally the system the original was supposed to be, created by people who knew that theory meant nothing if the gear failed when it was needed most. Personnel carried the A2 through later conflicts in the Middle East. With proper care, it did its job. It wasn't a legendary favorite, but it was functional and reliable. That was a major victory given where it had started. The story of the SA80's creation became a standard lesson in military and engineering circles. It served as a warning about the dangers of poor testing, political pressure, and the gap between the lab and the field. Wilson retired in 2000. There is a story that on his last day, he only took one thing from his office, not a trophy or a blueprint, but a letter. It had come in 1992 from a corporal recovering in a hospital. He had been injured when his gear jammed during a critical moment. The letter wasn't angry. It just asked one question. Did anyone who designed this ever have to rely on it when their life was on the line? Wilson never replied. He kept it in his desk as a reminder, reading it often as a form of reflection. Patterson became an instructor at a college in Derby. He started his classes with a lecture that wasn't in the books. He would show a photo of hands struggling with a jammed rifle. "This is what happens when we trust our math more than the real world," he told his students. "This is what happens when we forget that the world isn't perfect. This is the result of our mistakes." Some students found it too intense, but those who listened became the kind of engineers who insisted on the harshest testing possible. They were the ones who wanted to know exactly how something would break. Wilson passed away in 2009. His professional summaries mostly focused on his earlier, more successful work, but those close to him knew he never forgot that corporal's letter. Patterson is still teaching today. He tells the same story to every new class. He believes it's his duty to make sure someone remembers. The SA80A2 eventually became a reliable tool, but the lessons of its origin, the cost of overconfidence and the burden of good intentions gone wrong, remain. They live on in every design review that pushes for more realism and every engineer who asks, "How will this fail?" What is your responsibility to the people who will use what you build? The Imperial War Museum in London now holds both versions, the troubled L85A1 and the improved L85A2. They sit in glass cases, silent reminders of ambition, failure, and the long road to fixing a mistake. Most visitors walk right by, but some stop to read the history, and you can see a change in their expression. They recognize the pattern, the distance between what we want to create and what actually happens when our work enters the world. In 2018, the decision was made to eventually replace the system. Not because the A2 was failing, but because it was time for something better. The announcement was quiet, unlike the big reveal decades earlier. A few retired designers wrote in to defend the original concepts, but most stayed silent. Wilson was gone. Patterson didn't say anything publicly, though he was once seen standing in front of the museum display in silence for a long time. The real story isn't about the hardware, it's about the gap between theory and practice. The designers weren't the bad guys. They were professionals who believed in their expertise and wanted to innovate. Their mistake was a very human one. They forgot that tools aren't just puzzles to be solved on a screen. They are things people rely on when everything is going wrong. They trusted their own ideas more than the messy reality of the world. The true history of the system was written by the people who had to use it, the sergeant in the tent, the corporal in the hospital, and the countless individuals who learned to carry extra gear because they couldn't trust their primary tool. Perhaps the ultimate lesson, found in the corner of a saved letter or a classroom lecture, is that real expertise isn't found on a drawing board. It's found in the moments when things go wrong and someone is counting on what you built to work. In a storage file somewhere, that corporal's letter still exists. One day, a researcher will find it and understand the weight of that one devastating question. Did anyone who designed this ever have to rely on it when their life was on the line? The answer was no. That was the core of the problem. The SA80 remains in the museum, a testament to a difficult journey, but the question itself will never go away. It applies to everything we build while sitting in comfort and safety. Everything we think is perfect until the day someone actually needs it to be. That question is the part that truly lasts. If this story reminded you that making an impact often means facing hard truths, subscribe, tell us where you're watching from, and join us for the next historical journey. What legacy will you leave behind when your work is done?